1819, Alabama was a state at last. 278 years after DeSoto's scribes recorded his trip across the Southeast, Alabama became a part of the United States of America. Many settlers started moving into Alabama. We know, though, that there were a lot of people in Alabama even before statehood. We've talked about the Spanish and the French, the Africans, well, the Scandinavians, the Scotch-Irish, people from many other parts of the country that had already come to Alabama to find their homes. But with statehood, many more people came into the state. Some were wealthy, some were poor. Yet, they all had one major thing in common. They were all looking for a new place to settle. They were looking for places to grow crops and to raise children. They were looking for a place where they could worship in peace and security. Alabama had its share of conflicts, however. The American Revolution, as well as the Indian Wars, left deep scars on Alabama. Yet, in spite of these struggles, many settlers were thankful to be here. Now, the French had many struggles throughout the world's history. They had been defeated by the British, both here and abroad. Not too many years later, the French Revolution tore the country apart. The Emperor Napoleon then took over, and he was successful for a time. But when Napoleon was finally defeated by the British at Waterloo, his followers were in danger. They knew that they had to leave. At one time, Napoleon himself had considered coming to the United States if his empire in France fell. And perhaps that's why his friends and followers considered the United States as a possible new home. Napoleon, of course, ended up in exile, and there he died. If you visit the Mobile Museum, you can see a death mask of Napoleon. Just 1 year before Alabama became a state, the United States Congress granted the French refugees 92,160 acres of land on the Tombigbee River near the present-day town of Demopolis. In return, it was understood that a certain portion of the land must be devoted to the growing of grapes and olives. Unfortunately, the soil near what is now Demopolis just simply wasn't suited for grapes and olives, nor were these people suited for such a hard life. The Frenchmen were noblemen before Napoleon's exile, and they just weren't accustomed to such difficulties. But there was one bright spot, a true example of Southern hospitality. It was offered by Pushmataha, a true native of the South, and the Choctaw Indian chief. Pushmataha showed the people how to grow Indian vegetables and grain that were more suited to the soil. But the French were just not farmers, and life became harder and harder. To make things worse, they discovered after they had already done the back-breaking labor required to establish a colony, it was in the wrong place. So they painfully moved bodies and belongings to Eagleville, a town named after Napoleon's son, affectionately called Little Eagle. Today, it's difficult to find any traces of the French colonists, except for a few gravestones in the cemetery or an occasional olive tree. But all was not sadness and hard work for the Vine and Olive Colony. They loved music and dancing, and sometimes they held parties on the high white bluffs overlooking the river. Perhaps they did the Minuet, a dignified, graceful dance that started in France during the reign of Louis XIV. But it's more likely that they did the Quadrille, a sort of walking minuet that became popular in the 1800s in France. Let's try to imagine we're in France during the early 1800s as we watch a group of dancers from the University of Alabama do their version of the Quadrille. Notice the erect posture, which would have been necessary to support the weight of the costume of those days, and the position of the hands. This is a liberated dance in which the gentleman actually dares to touch the lady's hand. Finally, most of the French people had had enough of hardship. Some left and settled in Mobile. Others went to New Orleans. After things changed in France, some even returned home. But others remained as permanent residents of the cemetery. If you visit the State Archives Museum in Montgomery, you can see some interesting paintings of the Vine and Olive Colony. The paintings are actually wallpaper panels from a chateau or house in France. When statehood was announced, the city of Huntsville became the temporary capital. But by 1820, the new capital was completed at Cahaba. Cahaba seemed to be an ideal location, and many people thought it would eventually be the biggest town in Alabama. It had not just one river, but two to provide transportation. Men of wealth and fame and education built homes in Cahaba, and some of them were elaborate mansions. Riverboats brought guests up and down the river. Then, as they docked at Cahaba, they were met by fancy carriages that would take them where they wanted to go. Prosperity was short-lived, however, as Cahaba was flooded by her wonderful, accessible rivers. After the flooding of Cahaba, the state capital was moved to Tuscaloosa. The year was 1825. Settlers were continuing to move into Alabama, and other towns sprang up rapidly. During the era of early statehood, roads started to improve. Rivers were still very important means of transportation, and during these early years, a canal was begun around Muscle Shoals to make the shipping easier. The earliest railroad was also chartered. It ran between Tuscumbia and Sheffield in North Alabama. Around this time, a new movement was affecting Alabama. It was called the Classical Revival. We can still see its influences in our state today. During the major part of the classical era, which started years before in Europe, people were starting to revive the ancient architectural styles of Greece and Rome. Music was also being written that matched the organized style of the architecture. Writings of ancient philosophers were also being resurrected. Naturally, these ideas would spread to the United States, reaching the eastern U.S. first, since it was older and more settled and also had a closer connection with Europe. Ironically, the classical era in Europe was ending by the time its influence reached Alabama. Wealthy people, sometimes even under the most primitive conditions, started building beautiful mansions fashioned after those of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The influence of the Greek and Roman civilizations that we talked about earlier was now becoming a real part of the Alabama culture. Influences that could be seen with the eyes and touched with the hands. During the time when people were building mansions patterned after those of ancient days, they brought in outside materials. Yet, many things were just not available or perhaps too costly. Therefore, many Alabamians felled and sawed their own timbers. They farmed and fired their own bricks. As they copied the ancient styles, they often built around or added to the homes they already had, adding touches of their own. Much of the work was done by black slaves. Some were highly skilled workmen whose names have been forgotten. Yet, their work has survived the destruction of nature and war.